In this episode, I'll be teaching you how to create this forest meditation photo using advanced Photoshop compositing techniques and 4 images from my stock photo collection. I'll be covering every step of the compositing process in detail, from selecting images and color correction to finalizing for export. You're watching the Nuzzaco Photography channel. Hey everybody, welcome to the first episode for the Nuzzaco Photography channel. If you guys don't already know me from my blog, I'll just go ahead and pull it up real quick. If you guys are really into in-depth tutorials, which is what I like to do, go ahead and check it out, chrisnuzzaco.com/blog, or if you hit the website, hit the photo blog button up here. I like to do a lot of advanced content. I don't really like doing tutorials explaining things like 3-point lighting for the 900th time and not explaining it particularly well. I like to get into the more interesting stuff. That's kind of what I specialize in. That's what I shoot. So I think you'll like the blog if you are really into upping your game, really. So anyways, here's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be compositing this image here of a woman meditating out in the forest. This is actually a composite of 4 separate images. And the images that we're going to be using to composite this photo today are actually these pictures here. They're actually 4 images from my stock photo collection. If you go to my website and hit the representation tab, you can find all of the agencies I am listed at. If you click on the links, they'll go straight to my galleries. Alright guys, before we dive into all the compositing work here, I just want to explain real quickly how I'm going to do the tutorial. This image is the byproduct of about 6 hours of post-production work. I don't expect anybody to sit down and watch me Photoshop for 6 hours. So what I have done to try and make this tutorial a little bit easier to put together is I have created a copy of my original PSD file, and I sort of broke it down and condensed it into all the essential steps. And I will be telling you and explaining and showing all the different steps that I took. I also demonstrate some of the techniques, and then I'll go ahead and show you the end result. Just like a cooking show where they're like, yeah, put it in the oven for 350, 1 hour, and 2 minutes later they're like, here it is, it's done. That's how we're going to do it. I think it's the most sane way to do this because there's a lot of just a lot of stuff that goes into this. So anyways, also a quick word about compositing. I highly recommend that you find images that go together pretty closely. If you look at a really good composite, these elements here, in mine for example, they have a lot of things in common. The matte, for example, the angle of view here, and the angle of view of this matte, and the angle of view of this ground element here, they all are pretty close to each other. The lighting is also pretty close as well. Can't stress enough, the better the elements going into the composite, the better your composite will be. I see a lot of people try to combine images that have no business being combined together, and I don't know why they're wasting their time. Just massive lighting differences, for example, that's usually the biggest deal. And even angle. It's too high up, it's too low, it just doesn't match. Or maybe the lens is really wide angle and you're working with a telephoto shot, and that can look kind of weird. So anyhow, these images here meet those requirements. Now before I dive into the actual compositing, I like to take my images and create a new blank canvas. And I like to dump them into this canvas and do a rough composite to see if they're going to go together real well. It's one thing to look at the images and go, okay, I think they're going to work. It's another thing to actually put them into a canvas and actually see for yourself how well they work. Alright, so I've got my 4 images here opened up in Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and start dropping things in one layer at a time. This is going to be our background. This is going to be the ground she's going to sit on. Her mat. And the woman herself. Now before I go any further, I do want to call attention to how easy this photo is to composite. I actually shot this specifically for people that are going to be buying images and compositing them together. And I actually prepared it for them specifically. If you'll notice that it's a pure white background here. If you go to a lot of stock agencies, you'll find these backgrounds that aren't really, they're not lit very well, to be perfectly honest. And I think they're kind of half done, really. With mine, it's really easy to work with. If you go down to the select your layer, right click, and go to blending options, you can actually do a really cool, rough, quick, fast composite with my type of material. Go down to the blend if area right here. I'm circling. See where it says this layer. What this does is it takes an input value, a brightness value, and it erases it basically. And if you'll look at this really carefully, the number 255 is the max. If we just go down one notch, there we go. We've already got ourselves a really clean composite to work with. So this is gonna, if it's, if the blend if works that well, just wait until you start doing the actual masking work. These things are really easy to work with. Alright, so we got her isolated. Now I'm not going to have her on her mat in the actual shot, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. Background needs to be way bigger. Now, just in case you guys are wondering, my policy on resizing image elements, I pretty much follow this rule of thumb. I try to keep the main subject the native resolution, and if anything else has to be resized up or down, I work around that. My theory is that if it's the subject, people's eyes are going to be drawn to it. That's what we'll be paying the most attention to. So that's why I'm doing this. And as far as the backdrop, it's just bokeh. There's no actual detail, so there's really not a lot that can go wrong. You can't really screw it up. It's pretty flexible on resizing, and it's all just blurry anyways. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put her on the ground. That looks pretty good. Now, of course, we are going to be getting rid of the gigantic stake that's sitting next to her later. I'm using my eraser tool. Again, this is just a rough composite here, just to see how things are going to line up. And take your mat. Oop, wrong layer. Yeah, it looks pretty good. About there. And again, we're going to go ahead and erase the unnecessary stuff we don't want. Do a little crop. And there you go. This is a rough composite. I would say we've got ourselves what looks like a winning combination with a lot of elbow grease put into it, of course, because this obviously is not a final product. But what this helps me do is basically figure out what I need to do and how well these elements could go together. I know that I need to do a little bit of work on the mat. It's not quite the right angle. Definitely have to do a lot of work on our edges. We'll go into that later. And also, I'm going to have to do some work on blending the foreground with the background. Obviously, I'll get rid of the giant stake too. But yeah, other than that, I think we got ourselves a winning combination. So we're going to go ahead and prepare our images. I don't need to save this. One of the first things that I did was go ahead and open this up and clone this thing out. It's pretty easy to get rid of the stake. All I did was just a gigantic clone tool with a huge feathering. Probably the easiest aspect of making this composite was getting rid of the stake. pretty easy. You want to go ahead and save a copy of that, but I don't need to for the tutorial here. The next thing you want to do is isolate her. Now I'm going to actually devote quite a bit of time to this because this is a pretty important section. The way that I isolate, there's a lot of ways you can do this, okay? There's no real right or wrong way, but the way that I do it is a pretty quick way of doing it, and it's pretty accurate. So what I do is I go ahead and make a copy of your background, highlight your layer, go up to channels, and you're going to want to pick the channel that has the greatest contrast between the white background and the foreground. The idea here is that you want to make a matte out of one of these channels that you can, basically a black and white matte that you can then turn into a selection and use to create your mask. In our instance here, the blue channel has the greatest amount of contrast. So we're going to go ahead and right click and duplicate that blue channel. And we're going to select just the blue copy here, and we're going to do some editing to it. I like to go up to the Levels tool, grab the shadow slider right here, and just crank it all the way up. Now, as you can see, this is pretty easy to work with. The hair here, you're going to have to play a little bit with. Go. Pretty good. Just hit OK. Now it's not going to be completely perfect, but if you zoom in, it's pretty good. Looking pretty good here. Now you will notice that we do have some bright areas here that have a little bit of junk in it that needs to be cleaned out. Some of these shadow edges can be darkened a little bit more. So what you want to do now is just take your dodge and your burn tools, and you're going to go ahead and darken or lighten these areas. So for example, I can take the burn tool here, select shadows, turn up the exposure, and just selectively darken that area. Now for the whites, you're going to go ahead and use the dodge tool, set it for highlights, turn up your exposure, and you can go ahead and blast away the white stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of this, and I will see you guys in just a minute. Alright guys, here we are. I've got the cleaned up matte. If you zoom in a bit here, you can see I have taken care of some of the problem areas. Now what you want to do is make a selection. You want to go up to your tools palette here and select your magic wand tool. Uncheck contiguous. This can help with selecting hair. And your tolerance, it varies. You don't have to set it up too high. In fact, you can actually use 1, but I try to use like 5 or something, again, to help with hair selection. And just go ahead and click on the black area here, and you'll get yourself a selection. Next, what you want to do is click on the RGB layer here. Turn back on all your regular layers. Go down to your background copy on your layers palette, click it, highlight it, go up to layers, layer mask, and then go to reveal all. I'm going to go ahead and select that mask palette right there, that little white rectangle. Go up to layers, or excuse me, go up to selection, inverse your selection. Get the little paint dumper tool here. Set your paint color to black, and while you've got your mask highlighted here, dump the black onto this background. And what happens is you isolate everything. So we've already made ourselves a matte down here. Now, I prefer it to have a different color. The checkered box doesn't really do it for me. There's a lot of stuff that you cannot see on the a little checker background there. So what I usually do is make a new solid layer, and I pick something like I'm kind of a big fan of this like mauve color, sort of maroonish, pinkish color. That way the white edges that need to be smoothed out stand out. Now obviously there's a lot of work that has to be done in the hair here. Now I'm in CS4, so I do not have the new hair selection tools that are available, and I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret here. Even with all the newest hair selection tools around, you're never going to get a perfect matte using them. You can get pretty close, and it depends on the background you're working on, and that's kind of my big point, is the background and what you're trying to throw it onto. And I'm going to go into more detail about that later and show you exactly what I mean. Before we get too much into that, we're going to concentrate on everything else here. You're going to want to look around and see there are a few areas here that you do need to touch up on the mat. So you can go ahead and click on the mat and take your paintbrush, and you're going to be using white and black. You're going to be using white to bring stuff back and black to take stuff away. So in this instance, I'm going to go ahead and use a white paintbrush. I'm going to go ahead and add in some of the my opacity is way down. There we go. I'm adding back in some of the detail that got eaten up. There you go. So you're going to want to go ahead and go across your mat here and look for areas like that and go ahead and touch them up. Alright guys, I've gone ahead and done some work on the image here and cleaned up some of the little outlying areas on the edges that got eaten up. And I just wanted to take a brief second here to show you some of the hair technique that I use. Now, like I said earlier, selection tools are awesome, they're getting better, but at the end of the day they're not always going to do all the work for you. So what I usually do is I make a very small brush, turn down all the hardness, lower the opacity dramatically, and even lower the flow. And what I do is I get in and I basically slowly erase away these fine pieces of white. And this can be really helpful, especially when you get like a really small brush and you're getting in real close, like on this little line here. If you don't have the fancy selection tools, this can be a big help. It is time consuming, but I think you get the idea. So I go through this and I select the strands of hair that I think are worthwhile trying to keep. And then once I've got a pretty good selection on these, a little more refined, what I will end up doing next is going to the Refine Edge tool. Now I know if you don't use CS4 or above, you don't have this tool. Sorry guys, but it is a huge help. And again, it's not an end-all be-all tool, but it does help a lot, and I'll show you guys how I use it. Okay. So once you've got your edges cleared up quite a bit, you'll still notice that there's some jagged stuff like up on her arm here. You still have like a little bit of that white halo. The easiest way to get rid of that is to go ahead and click on the mask, click on the masks tab right here, click on mask edge, and it'll bring up the Refine Mask Edge tool. This thing is a lifesaver. It really helps smooth out the edges. You can also, if you don't have this, you can actually reselect your matte, and you can go up. I can show you how to do that if you don't have this tool. Just go ahead and control click on the layer there, and what you can do is go up to the selection menu here, go to modify, and you actually do have some tools here: border, smooth, expand, control, expand and contract, feather. So you can definitely play with the edge of the matte. It's just not, and I believe this is in CS3. Don't quote me on it, I'm not entirely sure. I'm kind of assuming here. It's been a long time since I used anything less than CS4. But we're going to go ahead and use the Refine Edge tool. Now down here you've got a bunch of different selections. You can view it as just a matte, view it on white, black. Not a big fan of the red. I really like the selection that just shows you what you have right now with the background. And I'm going to go ahead and turn these off. So right off the bat, one of the things that I recommend doing is shrinking your mask. You want to contract it a bit. And if you contract it a lot, you can notice immediately. Boom, you see how it cut away quite a bit. You don't need a 100%. How much you contract really depends on how much of an edge you're trying to get rid of. 30% for me works pretty well. Feathering, I don't go too heavy. I usually do about 1 to 2 pixels. And I turn on just a little bit of smoothing. And that helps get rid of jagged edges along the selection. And then hit OK. And there you go. We've massively cleaned up our edges. They look way better. Again, if you have something like down here, for example, that needs touching up, you can go in there and blast away some of the extra stuff. But this has done a lot of the work for us. Or you could go ahead and you could just undo it and run the selection, the Refine Edge tool again, and just do a deeper contraction. That's another way to do it too. Now, as far as the hair, coming back to the hair here, it is definitely looking better after we ran that tool. Although you'll notice there are some stuff here that got lost. They just sort of burned out against that white backdrop, or they're just, quite frankly, they're just too hard to select. And the way that I solved that problem, quite frankly, is by painting. I just painted in hair. And this is done way more commonly than I think people realize. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people look at compositing results that they get, and they, especially with hair, and they curse a lot. They go, why can't I get a good selection of hair? Well, there's my dirty secret. I paint the hair in when I need to. It looks better. I mean, you know, seriously. The new tools are great, but even they have their limits. And I'm going to go ahead and show you, like, one of the limits of the new tools is they sometimes do this white haloing. It depends on the backdrop that you're removing the hair from. But they rely a lot on basically, you know, feathering the edges and transitioning the opacity. Instead of being like, you know, on and off, it's like 50%, 60%, 40%. And if we go ahead and create a new background here, different color, and let's say we go ahead and make this like a light yellow color we're trying to put her onto. You'll notice that the issues we're having with her hair strands are like they're not really viewable anymore. So the exact path that you take with hair selection, in my opinion, really depends greatly on what kind of backdrop you're dropping your foreground into. If you're going on to something darker, in our case, then obviously there is a lot more work required. And in my case, there definitely is, because we're going to be dropping her onto a green backdrop that's, you know, it's a little bit darker in color, and the white definitely shows. So, yeah, kind of sucks, but hey, that's just life. So what I'm going to do now is, now that we've got this selected, and again, this is just sort of a rough demo of what I did, clean this stuff out here. What I like to do is go ahead and save a copy of this and hold on to it in case I need to use it for something else. I think it's, if you're going to put a lot of work into a selection like this, you might as well save it and hold on to it if you think you're going to use it again. And that concludes the selection of the girl. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump into another canvas here. We're going to start putting stuff together and getting into the finer details of matching things. We will be completing the issues with her hair and also issues with the soft backlighting on her arm, as well as the broad highlights here that don't quite match the rest of the lighting. I'll show you how to deal with that. Alright guys, see you soon. Alright guys, here is the canvas with all the elements combined. If you look down here in the layers palette, you will go ahead and see that I have separated all the different elements into groups to help explain. The first thing I dragged in was the backdrop, then I had the ground, the mat, and then the girl. When I brought in the ground, there is a problem here with the horizon. If we were to just cut this thing like a hard line, it just won't look right. So what I ended up doing is creating a layer mask, as you can see down here. And I ended up doing a smooth transition. And the way that I did the smooth transition was I basically just used the paint tool, the paintbrush tool here. And you can, I'll go ahead and demonstrate with a new layer here. What I do is I get a really big brush, make it nice and big, turn off all the hardness on the edges, and then I just turn down the opacity really low, and I turn down the flow a bit too. And what I basically do is I just I kind of feather up a bit, and I basically blend the layers together that way. Now I'm going a little bit too fast here. I probably should turn my opacity down a bit more and reduce the flow, because what you're trying to get is a really subtle transition like I did in the final product here. And the whole idea behind this is you're trying to kind of make it look like the background is basically kind of going into that bokeh look, and it's sort of blending in with the forest there. And the best way to do that is to do a very gradual transition. And it can take a little bit of time. You gotta be patient when you have your flow and your opacity set so low, but it's worth it. In fact, I kept some of this translucent up here just to help that transition, because if I turn it off, you can see right up in here there's a color change. And so I find that that was really helpful in creating that illusion. So the end product ended up looking like that. That's what I liked that. I thought that looked pretty good. Next I had to drop in the matte. Obviously I made another layer mask, and this is what it looks like after I do the layer mask. I will also add in that I did do a little bit of transforming on this. Not a whole lot. If you select your layer, the picture here, and then you go up to Edit, hit Free Transform, if you hit the Control key, you can pick an edge or a corner and you can manipulate it in a lot of ways. And so I ended up fiddling around with this for a little bit to basically adjust how the lines go towards the horizon to make them match up a little bit better with what I thought looked right. Then I ended up dropping her into the composite as well. And here you go. We've got all of our elements assembled in terms of positioning and scale. Now the next step of the process is to get them to look like they actually belong together. And just a reminder of where we're headed. That's the final product. That's what we're working with. pretty far cry. Lots of work ahead. So first thing that I decided to do was adjust her. And there's a couple problems. Obviously her hair is an issue. Specifically right up in here, that soft backlight from the white background, which is also on her arms, on her shirt, on her legs. It's everywhere, man. And it just does not match the environment. So the best way to solve this problem, and this is definitely one of the best secrets around, is to go ahead and select the layer, the actual picture, okay, not the mask. Grab your paintbrush, and you're thinking, oh, more painting. You're going to go ahead and want to drop down the size of your paintbrush. All right, that's good size. Drop your hardness all the way down. Turn down the opacity. You want to have like 20 to 30. I usually work around 25-ish or so. Flow depends on, I guess how steady your hand is really. I usually turn it down a little bit here. You're going to want to select darker color for your painting mode. And go ahead and press the Alt key and select a sample of darker skin next to that white edge. So in this case right here, we're going to go with this one right here. You've got your color selection. Now just slowly, gradually start to paint that white area. Try your best to stay in that white area. And as you can see, we are getting rid of that highlight. Now you're going to want to go ahead and resample liberally because the tones change, okay? They definitely transition, and if you just stick with one color, it's not going to work. So you have to continuously be sampling and slowly painting in. And you just got to use your eye, man. Just paint until it looks good, like it never existed. Now I'm not going to sit here and do the whole thing, but that's what I ended up doing for these edges here. And I even did it on the hair. That's one of the reasons why I was like, hey, you know, you can be kind of lax on the hair earlier because you can use this technique, especially in this type of situation, to deal with the hair. And even if you don't have frays, this was actually a joy to use on these frays here because I just ended up turning a lot of these white areas black, and then I ended up painting in and connecting some strands and enhancing some of the stuff on her collarbone there. But like for example here, there aren't any strands. It's a pretty hard edge really. There's nothing really fray looking there, and it has to be dealt with. So you can use this tool to help you deal with that. Now if you're worrying about texture because it is a little bit burned out there, you can also copy. You can use the clone tool to copy some of the Luma information. You can play around with the blending modes on your clone tool there. I didn't really have to do that though because ultimately these areas here, this hair is going to get crushed because I already determined that I wanted to have some strong contrast. So I didn't have to get too crazy about this, but I did have to paint it regardless because the white definitely wasn't going to do the job. So there you go. That's a rough demonstration of how I dealt with the problems with the soft backlight. Now after all of that work, and this to cover everything here definitely it takes a bit of time, so we're going to jump forward. I have it prepared for you guys to look at. This is the final product here. This was after all the painting I did. Now notice the hair's not perfect. It's okay. It's going to get crushed down anyways. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys another comparison here so you can see. This is with the painting on the edges and this is without. So already there's a massive difference. She's already looking like she belongs in the picture more than she did before. The other problem we're having with this girl is that she does not have her highlights like on her face and her chest. This was originally photographed with a huge softbox right next to her. So the highlights are nice and diffuse. It's just that they're a little too hot. They don't really match, for example, the matte. It just doesn't really blend in with the ground, and it just doesn't look white right. So what I ended up doing was taking a burn tool, selecting highlights, and turning down the exposure way, way low, and going up on these highlight areas here, and very slowly darkening them. Now, the problem with this, though, is that the highlights, a lot of people don't really understand this, but you can actually have different amounts of saturation within the image based on how bright or how dark a tone is, and a lot of times the midtones have way more saturation in color than the highlights do. It's not that there's any color information here, there is. It's just not as saturated. And when you're done with all this painting, what you wind up having is this. If you look at the really bright highlights, you'll see that they're not discolored, they're desaturated. Okay? It's important to understand that they're not discolored, they're desaturated. And the way to fix this highlight saturation problem is to go ahead and use your sponge tool and go ahead and select very low flow. Can't stress that enough. You don't want it to be too much. And again, turn your softness all the way down to the edges. And let's see here. There we go, that's a good size. Select the actual photograph itself. And you can go ahead and selectively resaturate these highlights. I'll go ahead and do a little before after. There's the before. It's kind of subtle right now. There's the after. Obviously, this is looking way better than it did before, and it becomes even more noticeable when you do the rest of the highlights. And so when you're done doing that, you can see it up on her chest here, on her shoulders, hands. When you're done with all the highlights, it looks a little more like that. I think I got a little bit liberal and ended up resaturating more than just the highlights here. But you can definitely see a difference here. It almost looks like she's got like, I don't know, like a gray kind of a dust on her or something like that. Don't want that. That solves the problem. Cool. Now if we back ourselves out, go ahead and do another comparison here to show you guys the progress that we have made. This is where we're at. This is where we came from. So as you can see, we're getting a lot closer to having ourselves a much more seamless looking composite. Alright guys, now that we've made her look a little more like she actually belongs in the scene, the next step in the process here to completing this illusion is dealing with the lack of shadow on the mat here. And the way that I did this, I didn't really use the best technique. Like I said, I just condensed my actual project file, and what I ended up doing was actually painting onto the actual mat itself. I should have created a blank layer and just painted on that instead, but I didn't. That's what you really should do, but anyhow, it ended up working out for me because I make copies and backup layers and everything, so it wasn't that dramatic. So what you end up doing here is basically just taking a paintbrush. I know there's a lot of painting in this tutorial, but that's how I got everything to work. And you're going to want to go ahead and turn down the opacity quite a bit, like 10% or so. And you also want to turn down the flow. Select black as your paint. And you want to make sure your brush has no hardness on the edges and is kind of big. There we go. And what I do is I just start from the outside and work my way in. So I'll take a big stroke like this, a couple of these, and then I'll work my way in. So now I'm going to start from like, 75% of the way in, and then I'll start a little bit closer. That helps you get a little bit of a feathering action. Now, if you need to go back out and do more darkening, you can pull down the opacity a little bit more. There you go. As you can see, you're now starting to get a feathered, diffused looking shadow. There you go. And as you can tell, just by looking at it, this is way more realistic than that. So you're going to want to go ahead and do both shadows under each leg, and when you're done, you'll have something that looks like that. So again, little comparison here. Shadow. Oop. Shadow, no shadow. So quite a big difference. Really helps pull together the illusion that everything belongs now. So basically where we are at in the compositing process now is basically we have the lighting has been smoothed out a bit more. We have created realistic shadows that look like they belong in the picture. And now the real main problem is getting everything to match in terms of color, contrast, and saturation. And this actually takes not a lot of time to explain. It does take a little bit longer to actually do it, but I'm going to go ahead and break down exactly what I did. Now in my background layer here, actually before I get too much into this, I will explain some of my methodology to it. I personally am of the school of thought that you want to kind of neutralize everything and get the colors to match and then do your overall grade. So basically what I try to do is create a logarithmic looking image, something that looks like it came out of the camera raw and you just turned off all of the processing settings. You have like a linear curve and all that sort of jazz. You haven't really done much to the white balance. I like to start from there because that's how I would normally process an image. Now there's other people out there that think that you should, for example, color correct everything to match the girl in the foreground here. So they would change all the colors and these different elements to match her. And that's another way you can do it. Again, this isn't the gospel. There's a lot of ways you can do it. This is just how I personally do it. Before we get into all of the individual color corrections that I made, I want to show you guys real quickly how to do clipping masks with adjustment layers. You want to select the layer that you want to adjust, that you only want your particular adjustment to be applied to. Click on it. Go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. You're going to choose which tool you want to use here. So in this case, we're going to try the Curse tool. Now in the dialog box here, it'll ask you, use previous layer to create clipping mask. You're going to want to have that checked. Hit OK. And what you end up having is a layer, an adjustment layer here. And if you look closely, you'll see a little arrow that comes out and points down. If you use this adjustment right here, this curves adjustment will only affect this layer down here. There's another way that you can release and unrelease a clipping mask. You can right click and go release clipping mask, and you can right click again and hit create clipping mask. The way that I started off was I pulled back the saturation on the green here in the background in the forest, and then I lightened it up a bit. Now keep in mind, everything I'm doing here, it's sort of a juggling between the layers. I don't just do one layer. I kind of go back and forth between all the layers and massage them to the point where I think, okay, these look pretty good. For the ground, again, I pulled back on some of the saturation, particularly in the reds, brought it down to a more neutral color. And I ended up doing some color adjustments here with the curves tool. Now, it's important to understand that when you're in a green forest environment, the light that is in that forest will be bouncing off of the leaves, and it will affect the color of everything else in there, like her skin tone, the mat, the ground. And in fact, if you ever have watched the Lord of the Rings special edition, the really big box DVDs, they have like behind the scenes footage, like hours of it. There's a really cool thing that they did with one of their miniature sets. They printed out big forest photos like this, and they actually surrounded a black obsidian looking tower model, and they lit they bounced a bunch of light off the photographs and let that light get on it. They bounced a bunch of light off the photographs and they let that light hit the set, so they had realistic looking reflections, but also had a realistic color, because they were trying to make this tower look like it was sitting in the middle of a forest. So I did the exact same thing, but just digitally, and with my curves tool I ended up adjusting the different channels. So I pulled up a little bit on the reds, I pulled back on the blue, and it didn't do too much. I left the green channel as is, and what that ended up doing was creating a warm greenish color cast to the ground, and as you can tell, it matches much better. It looks more like the green light from the trees bouncing around is actually hitting the ground here. Same thing with the matte, although the matte was pretty neutral in color. So what I ended up doing with the matte was simply desaturating it a bit more, pretty subtle, and I used the curves tool to darken it down a bit. With the girl, a little more complicated. The first thing I did was desaturate her completely. She just had way too much overall. I used the curves tool to introduce the necessary color cast to make her look a little more like she's in the forest there. And again, I isolated some of the reds here and desaturated those a little bit more to make her match better. And now there you go. We have achieved a logarithmic looking kind of a raw image. Now that I've got my overall logarithmic looking kind of desaturated composite ready to go for final color correction, all I did for this one was just a simple curves adjustment. I brought up the highlights and crushed the shadows down, and this is the final result. And by the way, I actually knew, because I've done this so much, I already knew in advance that this final curves adjustment was going to introduce a lot more saturation back into the colors. So I knew in advance that you want to desaturate certain elements, like the green here. Like if I didn't do the desaturation here, it would have been like toxic green. Don't want that. It's a little too much. Same thing with everything else in the composite. It just would have been too vivid. So there you go, guys. We've got our completed image. Now we need to finalize everything for export. And what I do is pretty simple. I just go ahead and select all the layers. I hit Shift and click from the bottom to the top. That selects everything. Right click on one of your layers and then just select Merge Layers. Now I'm working in an 8-bit project here, and this matters more in a 16-bit project. You definitely want to merge all of your layers if you're working in a high bit depth project like 16-bit or 32 before you jump down into 8-bit. And the reason is pretty simple. It can really jack things up if you try to, let's say you got a bunch of layers down in here and you got lots of adjustments and it's all at 16-bit. If you then go and convert the project into 8-bit to save it in a JPEG, you'll start to see all sorts of weird banding I don't understand why that happens. I just know that's what happens if you don't merge and collapse all your layers before you go into the next bit depth. So definitely merge before you convert to a lower bit depth. That always helps. I have personally always found it to work. That's what I recommend. So you can go ahead and set your color profile. If you want to jump into something else, just go to convert profile. Right now it's just an sRGB. Not really going to bother with any of this here because I'm not going to do any exporting, but now is the time when you'd want to go ahead and choose your color space. In fact, I would recommend you choose your color space before you do any bit depth conversions. And then you can just go ahead and save your project. And that's basically that. Cool. Well, thank you guys for watching. This is my first video tutorial, specifically post-production heavy tutorial. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. Also check out my blog here. I've got a lot of cool stuff. Again, I like to do things that are more advanced and difficult. I specialize in that kind of work myself. That's why people get me to do their stuff, because they know that I can do the complex shots that other people don't necessarily know how to do. And that's kind of what I like to talk about. I don't really like the simple. I like to get things a little more technical, a little more fascinating. So go ahead and check out the blog. Also, if you go to my website, hit the representation tab here, you can see all the different agencies, and I've got links to all the agencies that I'm represented at, and these go directly to my portfolio, so you can go ahead and check out some of the images. And yeah, I will see you guys next time.